Huelva, Spain, the 30th of April 1943. Before the sun has climbed over the Atlantic coast, a local fisherman sees something drifting in the water. At first, it looks like wreckage from the war that has been moving closer to Spain month by month. Then the shape turns over with the tide, and the fisherman realizes it is a man. The dead man is wearing the uniform of a British officer. Around his waist is a life jacket. Chained to his wrist is a briefcase. Inside that briefcase are papers marked secret, the kind of papers that could change where armies move, where ships sail, and where thousands of men will die. The Spanish authorities recover the body. The name on his documents is Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. He appears to have been killed in an aircraft crash at sea while carrying sensitive material from Britain to Allied headquarters in North Africa. It is exactly the sort of accident that happens in wartime. One aircraft lost, one courier dead, one briefcase washed ashore in the wrong country. But the most dangerous thing about Major Martin is not what the papers say. It is how ordinary everything around him appears. The wallet, the identity card, the theater ticket, the receipt for a ring, the letters from a woman who believes he will return, the small traces of a life interrupted. That is the genius of Operation Mincemeat. It was not built on spectacle. It was built on boredom, grief, paperwork, and the habits of men who believed that documents told the truth. The Allies did not simply place false plans on a corpse and hope for luck. They built a dead man credible enough to pass through Spanish hands, German intelligence, and finally into the mind of Adolf Hitler. The question is not whether the Germans were fooled by a body. The question is how British intelligence turned one unknown dead man into a weapon aimed at the entire German defense of the Mediterranean. By the spring of 1943, the Allies had a problem so obvious that it became dangerous. North Africa was almost won. Axis forces in Tunisia were collapsing. The next step had to be somewhere across the Mediterranean, and on any map the answer seemed clear: Sicily. The island sat between North Africa and Italy like a stone bridge into Europe. It threatened Allied sea lanes, guarded the central Mediterranean, and offered airfields from which the Allies could pressure Italy itself. For American and British planners, Sicily made military sense. That was precisely the trouble. If Sicily looked obvious to the Allies, it looked obvious to the Germans too. A direct landing against a prepared island could become a bloodbath. The defenders did not need to know the exact beach. They only needed to concentrate enough aircraft, armor, coastal guns, and reserves to strike the invasion before it could settle on shore. The Allies had learned hard lessons from amphibious warfare. A landing force is never weaker than in its first hours. When men are climbing out of landing craft, radios are wet, roads are blocked, and commanders are trying to understand a battlefield they have never seen. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, would require one of the largest combined operations of the war. American troops under George S. Patton, British troops under Bernard Montgomery, naval forces, airborne units, supply ships, landing craft, and thousands of aircraft would all have to converge on a single island. A mistake in deception could be paid for on the beaches. The enemy had to be made to look elsewhere, not just with rumors, not just with radio traffic, not just with fake formations on paper, but with something so personal and accidental that Berlin would think it had stolen the truth. British intelligence needed to create a secret the Germans would believe because they believed they had discovered it for themselves. That was the central logic of mincemeat. Never hand the enemy a lie. Make him steal it. The roots of the plan reached back to British naval intelligence, where deception was treated less like theater and more like engineering. A wartime memorandum compared deceiving the enemy to fly fishing. The bait had to suit the fish. It had to drift naturally. It had to arrive in the right water at the right moment. Among the officers connected to this culture of deception was Ian Fleming, then serving in naval intelligence long before his name would become attached to fictional spies and impossible gadgets. But Operation Mincemeat was not fantasy. It depended on pathologists, tides, consular habits, Spanish politics, German hunger for secrets, and the small weaknesses of bureaucracies. The basic idea was grimly simple. Find a body, dress it as a British officer, attach convincing papers, and allow the corpse to wash ashore in neutral Spain. Spain, under Francisco Franco, was officially neutral. But neutrality in 1943 did not mean sealed borders or clean hands. German intelligence operated there. Spanish officials varied in sympathy. Some were cautious. Some leaned strongly toward Germany. British intelligence believed that if the right body appeared in the right place with the right documents, the papers might pass quietly from Spanish custody to German hands. That word, might, carried the entire risk of the operation. If the body was examined too carefully, the deception could collapse. If the documents looked planted, the deception could collapse. If the Spanish authorities returned the briefcase unopened, the deception could fail. If the Germans suspected the corpse was too perfect, the deception could become evidence against the Allies. Every detail had to survive contact with people who were trained to doubt. Yet the plan's greatest strength was its ugliness. War produces bodies. War produces crashed aircraft. War produces couriers, sealed letters, lost briefcases, and uncomfortable diplomatic accidents. Mincemeat worked because it did not ask the Germans to believe in a miracle. It asked them to believe in a mistake. The dead man selected for this role was not a soldier, not an intelligence officer, and not anyone who had chosen to serve in the shadows. His real name was Glyndwr Michael. He was Welsh, poor, and alone in London. He died in January 1943 after ingesting rat poison. That human fact should never be rushed past, because it is the moral center of the story. The operation remembered him for what his body could do, but history has to remember that he was a man before he became a military instrument. British intelligence needed a body that could plausibly appear to have drowned after an aircraft crash. It needed a man of suitable age, without relatives likely to demand immediate explanation, and without injuries that would contradict the story. Such a body was difficult to find, especially in a country where war deaths were already surrounded by grief, identification, and family claims. Once Glyndwr Michael was chosen, intelligence officers did something chillingly intimate. They built him a second life. The corpse would become Major William Martin, Royal Marines. He would not be heroic in the obvious way. He would be normal. That was the key. His uniform had to fit. His documents had to show routine. His pockets had to contain the clutter of an actual person. A military identity card, keys, cigarettes, receipts, personal letters, a bank letter, a bill, the tiny evidence of a man who had been living, borrowing, traveling, forgetting, postponing, and loving. The false fiancée, Pam, became one of the most important parts of him. A photograph and personal letters suggested an emotional life outside the war. An engagement ring receipt made him imperfectly human, a man with plans beyond military orders. The deception did not depend only on the secret letters inside the briefcase. It depended on the dead man's pockets. German analysts, if they saw the material, would not only ask what the documents said, they would ask whether the man carrying them felt real. British intelligence made sure the answer was yes. The briefcase attached to Major Martin contained the heart of the deception, but even there the British avoided making the lie too clean. A crude plan might have placed a map in the case with arrows pointing to Greece and Sardinia, as if the Germans were meant to be children. Mincemeat was subtler. The most important document was a letter from General Sir Archibald Nye to General Sir Harold Alexander, the senior British commander in North Africa. The letter suggested that Allied attention was turning toward Greece and Crete, while Sicily would serve as a deception target. This was the inversion that made the plan dangerous. The real target, Sicily, was described as part of the cover story. That meant if the Germans heard other evidence pointing to Sicily, they might reinterpret it as Allied misdirection. The second major letter came from Lord Louis Mountbatten to Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. It introduced Martin as an amphibious warfare specialist and contained casual details designed to feel authentic. One of the famous elements was a sardine joke, an indirect nudge toward Sardinia. The deception was not written like a spy message. It was written like correspondence between busy senior officers who believed they were speaking privately. That mattered. Official papers often reveal as much in tone as in content. The letters needed the right level of familiarity, the right military assumptions, the right hints of irritation, the right sense that the true meaning was almost accidental. If the papers shouted, the Germans might step back. If they whispered, they might lean in. British intelligence understood that stolen secrets feel more trustworthy when they require interpretation. The Germans would not merely read the letters. They would decode their implications. They would flatter themselves by finding the truth between the lines. The lie would be stronger if German intelligence believed it had completed the puzzle. Now the operation had to solve its hardest practical question. Where should the dead man be found? Not just any neutral coast would do. The body had to drift ashore quickly enough to support the aircraft crash story. The authorities had to handle the briefcase in a way that opened a path to German intelligence. The British representative on the ground had to behave convincingly. The local medical examination had to be limited. And the Germans had to be close enough and interested enough to move fast. Huelva, on Spain's southern Atlantic coast, offered that combination. The currents made it plausible that a body placed offshore could reach land. German diplomatic and intelligence contacts were present. Local Spanish military authorities were considered likely to cooperate with the Germans or at least allow access. The British consul, Francis Haselden, was trusted enough to play his part. In other words, Huelva was not chosen because it was convenient. It was chosen because it was leaky. Mincemeat was a controlled leak disguised as an accident. That is one of the least understood parts of the operation. The British did not merely want the body discovered. They wanted the Spanish to delay, examine, discuss, and mishandle the documents just enough for German intelligence to copy them. Then Britain had to appear alarmed. But not so alarmed that the alarm looked staged. Too little pressure, and the Spanish might not treat the papers as valuable. Too much pressure, and the Germans might suspect a trap. The operation required a performance after the body was found. Messages, inquiries, diplomatic urgency, controlled frustration. The briefcase had to look like a disaster the British were desperate to repair. In reality, that desperation was part of the bait. A false secret is weak if the enemy thinks it was offered. It becomes powerful when the enemy watches its owner try to get it back. In April 1943, the final preparations moved from desks and letters into steel, ice, and secrecy. The body, dressed as Major Martin, was placed in a special metal canister packed with dry ice. The container was marked in a way that concealed its true purpose. It was loaded aboard HMS Seraph, a British submarine already experienced in clandestine operations. Even the crew did not fully know what they were carrying. That detail matters because operational secrecy was not ornamental. It protected the deception from accidental language, rumor, or nervous behavior. On the moonless night of April 30th, Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast. The officers brought the container up. The body was released into the water with the briefcase attached. The sea, for once, became part of the intelligence chain. It had to move the body toward shore, but not too perfectly. It had to damage the corpse enough to support the crash story, but not destroy the documents. It had to make the discovery feel accidental. When the fishermen at Huelva found Major Martin, the first act of the deception had succeeded, but only the first. The body was examined by Spanish doctors, and the official cause of death supported drowning. A more thorough autopsy might have raised problems. The British consul's presence and the circumstances helped keep the process limited. Major Martin was buried with military honors in Huelva. Publicly, he became another wartime death. Privately, British intelligence waited to learn whether the briefcase had begun its real journey. The dead man had reached Spain. The question now was whether his papers would reach Berlin. For the next several days, the operation entered its most delicate phase. The Spanish Navy held the briefcase. German intelligence wanted the contents. The British wanted the Germans to want them, but could not appear to want that. This is where mincemeat became a contest of behavior rather than documents. London sent messages expressing concern about the missing papers and pressing for their return. Some communications were sent in ways that British intelligence believed the Germans could read. The point was not simply to ask for the briefcase. The point was to confirm its value in enemy eyes. A document becomes more tempting when its owner behaves as though losing it is a catastrophe. Meanwhile, German agents worked through Spanish channels to gain access. The papers were eventually copied. When the briefcase was returned, it appeared officially sealed and proper, but examination in London revealed signs that the contents had been removed without openly breaking the envelopes. Small physical clues suggested that the letters had been rolled out and replaced. To a layman, that might sound minor. To intelligence officers, it was the moment the corpse began to speak. The Germans had likely read the material. But reading was not the same as believing. The Mincemeat team still needed confirmation that the documents had influenced German decisions. That confirmation would come through intercepted communications and the movement of forces. The war of deception was always connected to the war of signals. Bletchley Park and Allied intelligence were not just breaking codes for abstract knowledge. They were listening for the echo of their own lie inside the enemy system. If German units moved away from Sicily, if commanders discussed Greece and Sardinia as real threats, if Hitler's headquarters treated the papers as authentic, then Major Martin's false life had entered the bloodstream of the Third Reich. The deception worked because it met the German command structure halfway. It did not invent a fear from nothing. It fed a suspicion that already existed. Sicily was obvious, but obvious targets can be suspicious precisely because they are obvious. Hitler had long been sensitive to the Balkans. Greece, Crete, and the Eastern Mediterranean carried strategic and political weight. Sardinia also made sense as a stepping stone in the central Mediterranean. The British understood that the strongest lie is not the one that contradicts the enemy's mind. It is the one that confirms a doubt already living there. By mid-May, Hitler was treating Greece and Sardinia as serious threats. German and Italian resources shifted. Forces that might have strengthened Sicily were sent or held elsewhere. Sardinia was reinforced. Units were moved toward Greece and the Balkans. Even after the landings in Sicily began, evidence indicates that the German High Command still feared a larger blow might fall in Greece. That delay mattered. In war, deception does not have to paralyze an enemy forever. Sometimes it only has to confuse him at the decisive moment. The first days of an amphibious invasion are measured in hours. Every aircraft not over the beaches, every division not concentrated against the landing zones, every commander uncertain about whether the real attack has begun buys time for the men coming ashore. Mincemeat did not win Sicily by itself. It did not remove the need for courage, naval power, air superiority, planning, or brutal fighting inland, but it helped shape the conditions under which those soldiers landed. Its success lay in what did not happen as quickly as it might have, a fully concentrated Axis response at the vulnerable opening of Operation Husky. On the night of July 9th into the 10th of July 1943, the Mediterranean filled with ships. More than 3,200 vessels supported the invasion of Sicily, one of the largest combined operations of the Second World War. The sea was rough. A strong wind battered landing craft and scattered airborne units. Men trained for months found themselves fighting weather before they ever saw the enemy. American forces under Patton's 7th Army landed along the southern coast. Montgomery's 8th Army came ashore in the southeast. Above them, Allied aircraft tried to protect the beaches and strike Axis movement. At sea, the fleet had to unload men, guns, vehicles, ammunition, food, fuel, radios, medical supplies, and the immense machinery of a modern army. This was the real war that espionage served. Deception had meaning only because flesh and blood soldiers were about to step into danger. When those first waves approached Sicily, Major William Martin had been dead for more than 2 months. Glyndwr Michael had been dead even longer, yet the false identity created around his body was still doing work. Somewhere in the German command system, uncertainty remained. Was Sicily the main blow or the first act of something larger? Should reserves be committed immediately or held for Greece? Was Sardinia still at risk? The Allied landing was not easy. The campaign lasted 38 days. German and Italian forces resisted, withdrew, counterattacked, and evacuated many troops across the Strait of Messina. Sicily was not a clean victory produced by a trick. It was a hard campaign. But the deception campaign helped ensure that the first door into Axis Europe opened under conditions more favorable than they might have been. That is the proper scale of mincemeat. Not magic, not myth, a calculated advantage. The story is often told as though Hitler personally fell for a dead man's briefcase, and in one sense that is true enough to explain the legend, but the deeper truth is more useful. Operation Mincemeat succeeded because many systems failed in the right sequence. Spanish neutrality was porous. German intelligence was eager. The Abwehr wanted valuable material. Senior German officers were willing to fit the documents into existing assumptions. Hitler was predisposed to fear the Mediterranean's eastern flank. Allied codebreakers were able to watch the reaction. British diplomats knew how to appear nervous without ruining the act. Every piece mattered. Remove one, and the operation could have failed quietly. That is what makes mincemeat different from a simple spy story. It was not one brilliant forgery. It was a chain of credibility. The body had to be plausible to the fishermen. The medical story had to be plausible to the Spanish doctors. The documents had to be plausible to Spanish officials. The leak had to be plausible to German agents. The language had to be plausible to German analysts. The strategic conclusion had to be plausible to Hitler. The most impressive part of the operation is not that someone invented Major Martin. It is that Major Martin survived every institution that examined him. He moved from sea to shore, from police report to autopsy, from burial to briefcase, from Spanish custody to German copying, from Abwehr channels to strategic command. A fictional man traveled farther through wartime bureaucracy than many living men could. That is why the small details mattered. In espionage, a false identity is not judged by the beauty of the lie. It is judged by how many desks it can cross without dying. There is another reason the story still holds attention. It forces a moral discomfort that cannot be edited away. Glyndwr Michael did not volunteer. He did not receive orders. He did not sign a secrecy agreement, board a submarine by choice, or accept the risk that his name would disappear for decades. British intelligence used his body because war had placed him beyond consent and beyond family protection. That fact does not cancel the operation's military effect, but it does complicate how the story should be told. The men who planned mincemeat were trying to save Allied lives and shorten the path into Europe. They were working inside a war started by regimes that had made deception, occupation, and mass violence normal instruments of power. Yet even necessary wartime deception can carry a human cost that survives victory. For many years, the grave in Huelva carried the name Major William Martin. The real man beneath it remained hidden. Only much later was Glyndwr Michael's name publicly attached to the burial. That late recognition matters. It restores a person to a story that had turned him into a device. A serious documentary should not treat the corpse as a clever prop. It should treat him as a man whose anonymity was used by history, then partially repaired by memory. Mincemeat is powerful because it sits between respect and ruthlessness. It shows how democracies fighting for survival can still make cold decisions. It shows how the secret war often depended on people who never appear in victory photographs. And it reminds us that some of the dead served without knowing they had been enlisted. For the American soldiers who landed in Sicily, none of this would have been visible. A rifleman climbing out of a landing craft near Gela did not know about the canister aboard HMS Seraph. A paratrooper scattered by wind in the dark did not know about the letters to Pam. A naval officer watching the beachhead did not know how German intelligence had handled the briefcase in Spain. That separation is important. The men in combat experienced war as noise, confusion, fatigue, and immediate danger. The men in intelligence experienced war as timing, inference, documents, and uncertainty. Operation Husky required both worlds. The deception did not replace the infantryman. It served him. The false letters mattered because real men would soon need minutes, hours, and miles. Patton's 7th Army had to secure beaches, push inland, and eventually drive across the island. Montgomery's 8th Army had to fight through difficult terrain and strong German resistance. The U.S. Army Center of Military History describes Sicily as a campaign that became a base for the invasion of Italy and a training ground for officers and enlisted men who would later land in Normandy. That makes mincemeat part of a larger American story as well as a British intelligence success. It helped prepare the way for a coalition operation in which U.S. forces played a decisive role. The lesson is not that spies win wars alone. The lesson is that modern war is a system. A forged letter in London can affect a landing craft off Sicily. A fisherman in Huelva can influence a German reserve order. A false fiancé can help protect a real beachhead. In 1943, the road to Europe did not begin only with artillery and aircraft. It also passed through a grave in Spain. After Sicily fell, the political consequences moved quickly. Mussolini's regime collapsed in July 1943, and Italy's relationship to the war changed dramatically in the months that followed. The campaign did not end the war in Europe. It did not remove Germany from Italy. In fact, the Italian campaign became long, mountainous, costly, and bitter. But Sicily changed the shape of the war. It opened a route onto the European mainland, pulled German attention toward the Mediterranean, and gave the Allies experience in complex amphibious warfare before Normandy. Operation Mincemeat belonged to that chain of events. Its effect should not be exaggerated into a miracle, but neither should it be reduced to a curiosity. The German reaction was real enough to matter. The false documents were believed widely enough to influence deployments. The timing was close enough to help. That is the balanced truth. The danger in telling mincemeat is that the story is so strange it tempts exaggeration. A dead man, a fake fiancé, a submarine, a neutral country, secret letters. Hitler deceived. It sounds like fiction even when told plainly, but the verified details are already strong. The story does not need invented dialogue, fake last words, or impossible certainty about every mind in the German command. Its power comes from the discipline of its construction. Every object in Major Martin's pockets had a job. Every message after his discovery had a purpose. Every weakness in the enemy's intelligence chain became a path. And every path led toward the same conclusion: Sicily was not the main target. That wrong conclusion bought the Allies something more valuable than drama. It bought time. Operation Mincemeat also reveals something uncomfortable about intelligence work. Success often looks like an accident. No parade marks the moment a false assumption enters an enemy headquarters. No gun fires when a forged document is believed. No medal is pinned to the dead man whose body carried the lie. The battlefield result appears later, scattered across decisions that might never mention the operation by name. A division goes here instead of there. Aircraft remain committed to the wrong island. Torpedo boats shift away. Senior commanders hesitate. Reserves wait. Analysts misread the pattern because the pattern has been designed for them. By the time the deception is visible, it has already done its work. That is why mincemeat should be told slowly through its mechanics. The theater ticket matters. The coroner matters. The tide matters. The broken German code matters. The return of the briefcase matters. The small steel rods used to remove documents matter. These are not side details. They are the operation. In popular memory, the corpse is the hook. In military history, the process is the lesson. The British did not trust luck. They designed conditions under which luck could appear. They did not assume the Germans were stupid. They assumed the Germans were capable, ambitious, biased, and trapped inside their own expectations. That respect for the enemy's intelligence made the lie more effective. Mincemeat worked not because the Germans could not think, but because they thought along channels the Allies had carefully supplied. The best deception does not shut down the enemy mind, it guides it. By the time Allied patrols entered Messina in August 1943, Major William Martin had fulfilled a mission assigned to a man who never existed. Glyndwr Michael remained in Huelva, buried under a name invented for war. The soldiers who survived Sicily moved on to Italy, France, Germany, and memory. The officers who built mincemeat returned to secrecy, memoir, argument, and legend. The operation would later become famous, then simplified, then dramatized. But beneath the famous version is a quieter and more useful story. Operation Mincemeat was not a joke played on Hitler. It was a disciplined act of strategic deception built from human observation. It understood that armies are moved by maps, but commanders are moved by belief. It understood that an official document can be more dangerous than a bomb if it lands on the right desk. It understood that the smallest artifacts of civilian life, a letter, a receipt, a photograph, a debt, can make a lie feel more alive than a battlefield report. And it understood that in war, truth and falsehood do not travel alone. They travel through people, institutions, habits, fears, and pride. A dead man reached the Spanish shore. A briefcase reached German intelligence. A false invasion reached Hitler's mind. Weeks later, American and British troops reached Sicily. That sequence is the real story, not a miracle, not a myth, a chain, and every link had to hold. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.